For 7 years, every dried beef order that left Copper Valley passed through the hands of three orphans that the whole town once believed would starve before their first winter ended. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody dared. But in the spring of 1882, when Kittredge County opened claims on the far side of Copper Valley, 43 families rode out to stake their ground. Most chose the bottomland along Willow Creek, where cottonwoods grew thick and the water table sat close enough to dig a well in a single day. Others took the grazing meadows south of the wagon road, where cattle could fatten on blue grama grass without fencing. A few claimed parcels near the road itself, hoping to catch trade from freight wagons rolling between Silver Ridge and the railhead at Dunmore Station. Three young people claimed none of these. And they stood at the back of the line in the land office, their clothes faded but clean, their faces revealing nothing. The eldest was a young woman of 22, her dark brown hair pulled back tight, her gray eyes taking in everything and giving nothing away. Beside her stood a young man of 18, broad-shouldered and restless, his jaw set hard as if he expected a fight. And between them, a girl of 15, slender and watchful, clutching a small leather notebook against her chest. When their turn came, the eldest stepped forward and placed $14 on the counter. She filed on 160 acres at the top of Devil's Table Mesa. The clerk stopped writing. The room went silent. And then someone laughed. It started as a single bark of disbelief from the back of the room, but it spread like fire through dry grass. Within seconds, half the men in the land office were shaking their heads, elbowing each other, grinning at the spectacle of three orphaned children, claiming the most worthless piece of rock in the county. Devil's Table Mesa rose 280 feet above the valley floor, a flat, wind-hammered shelf of red sandstone and thin soil that had defeated every soul foolish enough to try it. There was no shade, no water, no shelter from the wind that swept across the rock face from the southwest every hour of every day. The nearest well was a mile downhill on the Brennan parcel, and old Marcus Brennan had already made clear he would charge 2 cents a gallon to anyone not named Brennan. 10 years earlier, a family called Hendricks had filed on that same mesa. They had arrived in October with a wagon full of hope and 2 young children. By March, all 4 were dead, frozen, starved. The wind had scattered what remained of their cabin across the rock like a cruel joke. Since then, everyone in Copper Valley called it the Devil's Land, and now 3 orphans wanted it. Marcus Brennan, 48 years old, owner of the only reliable well in the Eastern Valley, leaned against the doorframe and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. 3 orphaned children claiming the Devil's Rock. He shook his head slowly, savoring each word. They will be dead before Christmas. Mark my words. Garrett Holloway, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, a man of 52 who had built his fortune on Willow Creek bottomland, turned to look at the young woman. A 22-year-old girl thinks she is smarter than every man in this room. His voice carried the lazy confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong. That is entertaining, I will admit. From the corner, an older voice joined the chorus. Jonas Mercer, 67 years old, the man everyone called the wisest cattleman in the valley. He had lived in Copper Valley for 40 years. He had seen droughts and blizzards and everything in between. When Jonas Mercer spoke about land, people listened. Nobody can live on that rock, he said, not unkind but final. Nobody. The Hendricks tried. The wind killed them. He paused. These children will not last until the first snow. Pete Yardley, a young man of 25 who spent more time at the saloon than working his father's claim, slapped his hand on the counter. I will bet $5 they give up before August, he announced to the room. 10 says they are begging for creek bottom land by September. 3 men took him up on it. Father Callahan, the Catholic priest who served the scattered faithful of Kittredge County, stood near the window with a troubled expression. He said nothing, but his eyes followed the 3 young people with something between pity and prayer. The young woman took her claim papers from the clerk. She did not answer any of them. She did not defend herself or her siblings. She did not explain. She simply turned, met her brother's eyes, met her sister's eyes, and walked out of the land office with her head high and her back straight. Her name was Linnea Whitfield, and she knew exactly what she was doing. The story of how Linnea, Tobias, and Willa Whitfield came to Copper Valley began 2 years earlier and 1,000 miles east, in a small town in Pennsylvania, where their father, Friedrich Whitfield, had built a modest farm on land his own father had cleared. Friedrich was a good man, quiet, hard-working. He had married Anna Muller when they were both young, and together they had raised 3 children in a house that was never wealthy but never hungry. Then the diphtheria came. It arrived in January of 1880, carried into town by a traveling merchant who coughed once at the general store and was dead within a week. By February, the epidemic had spread to every corner of the county. Friedrich Whitfield fell ill on the 1st of February. He died on the 3rd. Anna, who had nursed him without rest, collapsed the next morning. She held on for 9 more days. Her children gathered around her bed, her hand growing weaker in Linnea's grip with each passing hour. She died on February 12th. Linnea was 20 years old. She dug both graves herself. The ground was frozen. Each shovelful of earth took 10 strikes with a pickaxe before it would yield. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. Tobias, 16 then, tried to help, but the fever that had brushed past him left him too weak to lift a shovel for more than a few minutes. Willa, 13, stood watch at the gravesite, her face pale, her eyes dry, her silence more frightening than tears. It took Linnea 4 days to dig the graves deep enough. She buried her parents side by side under the oak tree where her father had proposed to her mother 25 years earlier. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened her grandmother's journal. Margaret Whitfield had emigrated from the Black Forest of Germany in 1831. She had married, raised children, and died in 1867, 15 years before the epidemic. But she had left behind a leather-bound journal written in German, filled with careful observations about farming, preserving, surviving. Linnea had been reading that journal since she was a girl. Her grandmother had taught her the language, sitting together on winter evenings, translating passages, explaining techniques that had been old when Margaret's own grandmother used them. The section that mattered most described how the family had preserved meat and fruit for market, not in a smokehouse, in the open air, on wooden racks set along a ridge in the Black Forest where the wind never stopped. Margaret had written about it in detail. The angle of the racks, the width of the slats, the way moving air pulled moisture from flesh and fruit faster and more cleanly than smoke or salt alone. She described how the exposed rock of the ridge held heat through the night, keeping the temperature steady so the meat never sweated and never spoiled. She described how the height and the wind kept flies away when every barn in the valley below was black with them. Linnea had read that journal so many times, the pages were soft as cloth. Now sitting alone at the kitchen table in a house that held only ghosts, she read it again, and she began to plan. The bank took the farm 2 months later. The debts Friedrich owed were modest, but the crops had failed the previous summer, and there was nothing left to pay. Linnea sold what furniture she could, paid the burial costs, and counted what remained. $47. 1 mule named Slab, bad-tempered and stubborn but strong, a wagon with 1 cracked wheel, and her grandmother's journal. She gathered her siblings, looked them in the eyes, and told them what they were going to do. "There is land opening in Colorado," she said, "a place called Copper Valley. I have written to the land office. There is a mesa there, high, dry, windy. Nobody wants it." Tobias stared at her. "Why would we want land nobody else wants?" "Because nobody else understands what it is good for." She opened the journal and showed him the pages about the drying racks. Grandmother made her living preserving meat on a ridge in the Black Forest. The conditions there are exactly what this mesa has. Wind that never stops, stone that holds heat, elevation that keeps the flies away. We can do what she did. Tobias was skeptical. He had always been skeptical. It was his nature to question, to push back, to demand proof before belief. "And if you are wrong," Linnea met his gaze without flinching, "then we will fail. But we will fail trying something, not waiting to die in a poorhouse." Willa, who had said almost nothing since their mother's death, looked up from the journal. "Grandmother Margaret was never wrong," she said quietly. "Not about the land, not about survival." The 3 of them left Pennsylvania in April of 1880, but Linnea did not go directly to Copper Valley. She went first to Denver, where she found work washing clothes for a boarding house. Tobias hired on at a stable. Willa helped with cooking and cleaning. For 18 months, they saved every penny they could spare. And in the autumn of 1881, Linnea finally traveled to Copper Valley. She did not file a claim. Not yet. She rented a room above the general store for $2 a month. She took in laundry to pay her expenses. And every week, sometimes twice, she rode out to Devil's Table Mesa. She climbed the narrow trail to the top. She stood on that wind-blasted rock in November gusts that nearly knocked her flat. She measured the wind speed with a strip of cloth and a pocket watch. She noted the direction, southwest, almost always southwest. She watched how the sun struck the red sandstone and felt the rock hours after sunset, still warm from the day's heat. She stood on the mesa in January when ice formed on her eyelashes and the wind cut through her coat like it was not there. She watched and recorded. She stood on the mesa in March when the first warm gusts came up from the desert floor, and the air was so dry her lips cracked within an hour. She measured the humidity by how quickly a wet cloth dried. 14 minutes, faster than anywhere she had ever seen. She watched the valley flood in April, brown water swallowing fences, drowning 2 calves on the Holloway claim. She watched a brush fire sweep the South Meadows in late August, burning through 3 homesteads before it hit bare ground and stopped. She watched the mesa through all of it, untouched, high and bare and steady, wind pouring across the rock like a river made of air. By the time the land office opened for claims in the spring of 1882, Linnea Whitfield knew exactly what she wanted, and exactly why. 3 orphans, a cursed mesa, a 50-year-old journal. When everyone in the valley believed they would die, but Linnea had spent 6 months watching that rock while others dismissed it. What did she see that everyone else missed? Leave your thoughts in the comments before we continue. The afternoon after filing their claim, the Whitfield siblings started hauling lumber up the Mesa Trail. Slab the mule was not pleased. The trail was steep, narrow, and made of loose rock. Each trip took 40 minutes up and 20 minutes down. The mule brayed his objections with every step, his hooves slipping on the sandstone, his eyes rolling white with displeasure. Linnea led. Tobias pushed from behind when the grade steepened. Willa walked alongside, her hand on Slab's neck, speaking softly to calm him. They made 4 trips that first day, 6 the next. By the 3rd day, Tobias was ready to quit. "Sutter, this is madness," he said, his voice sharp with exhaustion. They were standing at the bottom of the trail, the morning sun already hot, another load of planks waiting in the wagon. "There has to be better land, land near water, land where we do not have to kill ourselves just to carry supplies." Linnea did not argue. She simply picked up her end of the next load and waited. "You are gambling our lives," Tobias continued, "Willa's life, on a journal written by a woman who died before I was born, about a place in Germany that none of us have ever seen." "Yes," Linnea said. "And you think that is wise?" "I think it is our only chance." They stared at each other across the lumber, brother and sister, 2 people who had buried their parents together and survived 18 months of scraping and saving together, and still could not agree on what survival looked like. It was Willa who broke the silence. "Grandmother Margaret was never wrong," she said quietly, the same words she had spoken in Pennsylvania. "And Linnea has been watching this mesa for 6 months. She knows what she is doing." Tobias looked at his younger sister, looked at the certainty in her 15-year-old face. "Fine," he said finally, "but if we fail, it is on your head." Linnea nodded. It always was. On the 3rd morning, something changed. A dog appeared at the bottom of the trail. She was a shaggy gray creature, thin as a rail, her ribs showing through matted fur. She had amber eyes that watched Linnea without blinking, intelligent and calm, as if she had been waiting for them to arrive. When Linnea started up the trail, the dog followed. When Linnea stopped to rest, where the dog sat. When Willa offered a strip of salt pork from her lunch, the dog took it gently, almost delicately, and swallowed it whole. "Can we keep her?" Willa asked, and it was the first time since their parents died that Linnea heard anything like hope in her sister's voice. "She can stay," Linnea said, "but she works like the rest of us." Willa named the dog Flint because the mesa was made of it. On the 5th day, disaster nearly ended everything. They were halfway up the trail, slab loaded with 60 pounds of planks, Tobias guiding from behind, when the mule's left rear hoof slipped on a patch of loose scree. It happened in an instant. Slab stumbled. His load shifted. The ropes holding the lumber snapped tight on one side and gave way on the other. 20 planks of good pine went sliding off the mule's back and tumbling down the cliff face, clattering and crashing 200 feet to the rocks below. Slab screamed. Tobias grabbed for the lead rope, missed, grabbed again. The mule's rear legs went out from under him, and for one terrible moment, he slid backward toward the edge, hooves scrambling for purchase on the loose stone. Linnea lunged forward. She caught the lead rope and threw her weight backward, her boots digging into the rock, her arms burning as she pulled. Tobias found his footing and added his strength. Together, inch by inch, they dragged Slab back onto solid ground. The mule stood trembling, his sides heaving, foam flecking his lips. The lumber lay scattered on the rocks below, a full day's work ruined. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Tobias looked at his sister. Really looked at her, saw the rope burns on her palms, the stone dust in her hair, the sweat soaking through her shirt. Saw the way she was already calculating, already planning, already figuring out how to recover the lumber and continue. She had not hesitated, not for an instant. She had simply acted without fear, without doubt, because the alternative was unthinkable. "I will climb down and salvage what I can," Tobias said finally. Linnea nodded. "And when I get back up, you can show me exactly where these drying racks are supposed to go." It was not an apology. Not exactly. But it was something. Tobias climbed down the cliff face that afternoon, retrieved 17 of the 20 planks, and hauled them back up a different route. It took him 6 hours. By the time he reached the top, his hands were raw and his shoulders ached in ways he had never experienced. But when Linnea showed him the journal, showed him the diagrams Margaret had drawn, showed him exactly how the angle of the wind and the heat of the stone would work together, he listened. He was still skeptical. That was his nature. But he no longer argued. Over the next 3 weeks, the Whitfield siblings built their drying operation. Linnea designed the racks according to Margaret's specifications. 24 frames, each 12 feet long and 3 feet wide, set on legs that held them waist-high off the rock. She built them in rows, angled 15 degrees into the prevailing southwest wind, exactly as her grandmother had described. The slats were spaced half an inch apart, wide enough to let air move freely through the meat, but narrow enough that nothing fell through. Tobias did the heavy lifting. He drove the support posts into cracks in the sandstone, wedging them tight with smaller stones and a mixture of clay and gravel. He carried loads up the trail without complaint now, his body adapting to the work, his muscles hardening under the sun. Willa kept records. She filled her notebook with observations about wind speed and direction, temperature at different times of day, the exact dimensions of each rack. She drew diagrams of the layout, labeled with Margaretta's instructions and her own additions. Flint took up a station at the top of the trail each morning and stayed there until dark, her amber eyes scanning the rock. She chased off the occasional hawk. She barked at coyotes that wandered too close to the trail below. Mostly, she sat in the wind with her ears flat and her gray fur rippling, watching the Whitfields work. They built a cabin at the east end of the mesa, tucked against a natural rock shelf that blocked the worst of the wind. It was 10 feet by 12 feet, with a plank floor and a tin roof and a door that faced the sunrise. Not large, not comfortable, but solid enough to survive what the mesa would throw at them. Linnea dug a cistern beside it, lined with clay hauled from the creek bed in buckets designed to catch whatever rain fell. It was not much. 20 gallons if a good storm came, and good storms were rare. But it was something. The first 2 weeks nearly broke all of them. The wind that Linnea planned to use as a tool was, before the racks were finished, simply an enemy. It tore the canvas off their supply pile twice. It blew grit into their eyes until Tobias's swelled shut one morning, and he had to sit with a wet cloth pressed over his face for an hour before he could see well enough to work. And then there was the water. 2 trips a day to the Brennan well, a mile downhill and a mile back up. Linnea carried 2 4-gallon buckets on a yoke across her shoulders, 16 cents a day just for drinking and cooking water. Her arms ached. Her shoulders developed calluses on top of calluses. By the end of May, the racks were built. The cabin was standing. The cistern held 14 gallons from a single afternoon thunderstorm that rolled through on the 23rd. And Linnea started drying meat. She began with beef, cheap cuts and trimmings bought from ranchers who had more cattle than they could sell fresh. Tom Ridley, who ran 600 head south of the wagon road, sold her 40 pounds of flank and brisket for $1.10. "You are not going to eat all that," he said, looking at her with the same puzzled expression everyone in the valley gave her. "No," she said, "I am not." She sliced the beef thin, no thicker than a quarter-inch, using a long knife she sharpened every morning on a whetstone she kept in her apron pocket. She rubbed each strip with salt and a little black pepper and a pinch of brown sugar, exactly as Margaret had written. Then she carried the strips up the mesa and laid them across the racks in the open wind and sun. The town thought it was pathetic. A young woman and her orphan siblings, standing on a bare rock, hanging strips of meat like laundry on a line. Garrett Holloway rode past the base of the mesa one morning and shook his head so hard his hat nearly came off. "Lord have mercy," he said to the men riding with him. "Those children are going to starve playing at being butchers." 3 weeks after the first batch of dried beef sold to a freighter named Duncan Cole, Marcus Brennan made his move. Linnea arrived at the well house on a Tuesday morning, buckets in hand, to find Brennan waiting for her with a new sign nailed to the post. "Water, 5 cents per gallon." She read it twice. "That is more than double," she said. Brennan smiled, the smile of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Supply and demand, Miss Whitfield. My well, my price. You do not like it, dig your own." Linnea calculated silently. 5 cents a gallon meant 40 cents a day. 40 cents a day meant more than half her profit gone before she dried a single strip of beef. Brennan knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to strangle her operation before it could grow. Tobias, who had accompanied her that morning, stepped forward with his hands clenched. "You cannot do this. People depend on that water. People can pay what the water is worth." Brennan's smile widened. "Or they can leave. Makes no difference to me." Linnea put a hand on her brother's arm. "Pay him," she said quietly. "Linnea, pay him. We will find another way." She counted out the coins, filled her buckets, and walked back toward the Mesa Trail without another word. Brennan watched her go, certain he had won. He did not see Linnea stop at the base of the trail and look up at the sky, studying the clouds building over the western mountains. And he did not see her pull out her notebook and write a single line. Expand the cistern, capture more rain, remove his leverage. Over the next 3 weeks, Linnea tripled the size of her water storage. She dug by hand, widening the clay-lined basin, adding a channel to catch runoff from the cabin roof. When the summer thunderstorms came, she captured 60 gallons instead of 20. Not enough to eliminate her trips to the Brennan well, but enough to cut them in half. Brennan noticed and began planning something more direct. Father Callahan rode up the Mesa Trail one afternoon in late June to see for himself what the Whitfield children were doing. He was a man of 55, gray-haired and thoughtful, who had served the scattered faithful of Kittredge County for 18 years. He had baptized children, married couples, and buried the dead. He had seen hope and despair in equal measure. What he saw on Devil's Table Mesa unsettled him. Linnea was standing at the drying racks, laying strips of beef across the wooden slats with quick, practiced movements. The wind pulled at her hair and her apron, but she moved through it as naturally as breathing. "Child," Father Callahan said, watching her work, "where did you learn this method?" "From my grandmother's journal, Father. She learned it in the Black Forest of Germany." "The Black Forest." He frowned. "That is very old country, very old ways." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some might call it pagan wisdom." Linnea continued her work without looking up. "My grandmother called it survival, Father. She raised 6 children on that wisdom. All of them lived to old age. All of them had enough to eat." She finally met his eyes. "I do not think God objects to his children learning how to feed themselves." Father Callahan watched for a while longer. He saw the neatly built racks, the carefully maintained cabin, the young woman working with a focus that bordered on devotion. He blessed the cabin. He blessed the work. He blessed the 3 young people who had taken on an impossible task. and he rode back down the trail without taking a side in Pete Yardley's bet. But he did not bet against them either. Jonas Mercer came to the Mesa on a June afternoon when the heat shimmered off the rock and the wind carried the dry smell of sage from miles away. He was 67 years old and climbing the trail winded him. But Jonas Mercer had spent 40 years learning everything there was to know about land in Kittredge County, and the sight of those drying racks on the Devil's Mesa had been nagging at him for weeks. Linnea saw him coming and walked out to meet him. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitfield." He looked at the racks, the rows of beef strips, deep red-brown, drying in the constant wind, the cabin, the cistern, the gray dog sitting at the top of the trail like a sentry. "You have been busy," he said. "Yes. May I ask why you believe this will work?" Linnea considered the question. Jonas Mercer was not like the others. He was not mocking her. He was genuinely curious. "Have you ever seen air-dried meat, Mr. Mercer? Done properly, I mean." "Cannot say I have. My grandmother dried meat and fruit on a ridge in the Black Forest for 30 years. The conditions there are almost exactly what this mesa has. Constant wind from a steady direction, stone that holds heat through the night, elevation that keeps flies and pests away." She walked to the nearest rack and picked up a strip that had been drying for 2 days. "Feel this." Jonas took the strip, turned it over in his weathered hands, pressed it between thumb and forefinger. "Firm," he said, "but not brittle. That is the difference between drying and burning. Smoke dries the outside and leaves the center damp. Salt dries unevenly and leaves a taste that covers the meat. This," she gestured to the racks, the wind, the sun-warmed stone. "This dries evenly, cleanly. The meat tastes like meat." Jonas chewed a corner of the strip. His eyebrows rose. "That is uncommonly good, he admitted. "It will last 3 months without spoiling. Longer if packed correctly." Jonas handed back the strip and looked at her for a long moment. "I told people you would not survive up here," he said finally. "I believed it when I said it. I know. I may have been wrong about the land." He paused. "But I am not ready to admit it yet." Linnea almost smiled. "Almost. You will see," she said. Jonas Mercer tipped his hat and walked back down the trail. He did not bet against them, but he did not bet for them either. Old Martha Briggs climbed the Mesa Trail on a July morning that was already hot enough to make younger people stay indoors. She was 74 years old, leaning on a walking stick carved from juniper wood, and she had not climbed anything steeper than her porch steps in 5 years. But Martha Briggs had heard the talk in town, and she had something to say. She found Linnea sorting dried beef by the cabin, with Willa helping to wrap the finished strips in wax cloth. "You," Martha said, pointing her stick at Linnea. "You are the one doing this?" "Yes, ma'am." "Show me." Linnea showed her the racks, the angle, the spacing of the slats, the way the wind never stopped moving across the rock. Martha listened, watched, touched the drying beef with fingers that had done hard work for 7 decades. "I knew it," she said finally. "Knew what, ma'am?" "My mother came from Bavaria, a village in the mountains. She used to talk about how her family preserved food on a high ridge where the wind never stopped." Martha's eyes were bright. "I thought she was making it up. Old country nonsense. But this," she gestured at the racks. This is exactly what she described." Linnea felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not known she was carrying. "You believe it will work?" "I believe you are doing something old and true." Martha tapped her stick against the rock. "Something these fool men have forgotten, if they ever knew it at all." She turned to Willa, who had been watching with wide eyes. "You, girl, you are keeping records?" "Yes, ma'am, in my notebook." "Good. Knowledge that is not written down is knowledge that can be lost." She looked back at Linnea. "You keep doing what you are doing, and when the doubters come around asking how you did it, you make them pay fair price for the lesson." She started back down the trail, then stopped and turned. "And you tell that Brennan man that Martha Briggs remembers when his daddy was a horse thief. And he might want to think about that before he tries to cheat decent folks on water." Then she was gone, making her slow way down the steep path, her stick tapping against the stone. Linnea watched her go. It was the first time anyone in Copper Valley had validated what she was doing. It would not be the last. Marcus Brennan was not a patient man. He had built his position in Copper Valley through 40 years of careful acquisition, buying land when others could not afford it, controlling water when others needed it, extending credit at rates that looked generous until the payments came due. The Whitfield siblings were a problem, not because they threatened his land or his cattle. Three orphans on a useless mesa posed no real danger to his holdings, but they were succeeding where everyone expected them to fail. They were proving that the poorest ground in the valley could produce something valuable, and they were doing it without his help, without his water, without his permission. When Brennan heard that the Army Supply Depot at Fort Bridger had started buying Whitfield jerky in bulk, he decided he needed better information. Samuel Dawes appeared at the base of the Mesa Trail on a hot morning in August. He was 17 years old, thin and hungry-looking, with the watchful eyes of someone who had learned early that the world was not kind. His family had given up their claim in the valley that spring, defeated by poor soil and worse luck. They had loaded their wagon and headed back east, but Samuel had refused to go. "I am not running away," he had told his father. There has to be something here for me." His father had given him $5 and a blanket and told him to learn what disappointment tasted like. Marcus Brennan had found him sleeping in the stable 2 weeks later. "I have a job for you," Brennan said. $2 a week. Easy work." The work was not work at all. It was watching. Brennan wanted to know everything about the Whitfield operation, the angle of the racks, the spacing of the slats, the timing of the drying, every detail. "Find out how they do it," Brennan said, "and I will make sure you eat." Samuel climbed the Mesa Trail that August morning and found Linnea sorting dried beef in the cool shade of the cabin. "I am looking for work," he said. "I will do anything." Tobias, standing nearby, studied the boy with suspicious eyes. "Where did you come from?" "My family had a claim south of the creek. They left. I stayed." "Why?" Samuel shrugged. "Because I do not have anywhere else to go." Linnea watched him for a long moment. 17 years old, alone, desperate. She knew what that felt like. "Can you carry 40 pounds up that trail?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you keep your mouth shut and follow directions?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then you start tomorrow, 50 cents a day in meals. You sleep in the small tent until we build something better." Tobias waited until Samuel was out of earshot. "You do not know anything about him." "I know he is alone and hungry. I know he climbed this trail without quitting. I know we need help. And if he is trouble..." Linnea picked up another stack of dried beef and continued sorting. "Then we will deal with it." Samuel was trouble. Not because he was lazy or incompetent. He worked hard, carried heavy loads without complaint, and learned quickly. But every few days he disappeared for an hour or two, claiming he needed to check something in the valley. Tobias noticed first. "He is meeting someone," Tobias said one evening, after Samuel had returned from one of his mysterious trips. "I followed him halfway down the trail. He was heading toward the Brennan place." Linnea said nothing, but she started watching more carefully. Samuel reported everything to Brennan. The angle of the racks, the exact spacing of the slats, the timing of each batch, the salt mixture, the temperature of the rock at midnight. Every detail Brennan asked for, Samuel provided. 3 weeks later, Brennan built his own drying racks. They appeared overnight on a shelf of ground 100 feet above the valley floor. Cheap copies of the Whitfield design. The angle was close. The spacing was close. The salt mixture was identical. The location was completely wrong. Brennan hung 50 pounds of beef on his racks and waited. 3 days later, the meat was crawling with flies. 4 days later, it had begun to rot. By the end of the week, the smell was so bad that even the coyotes avoided it. Brennan had copied every visible detail, but he had not understood any of them. Marcus Brennan copied every detail of Linnea's operation, the angle of the racks, the spacing of the slats, the salt mixture, everything. But his meat rotted while hers dried perfectly. Why? Think about what makes the Mesa special before we reveal the answer. Leave your guess in the comments. The answer was simpler than most people expected. "He built too low," Linnea explained to Willa the next evening, sketching a diagram in the dirt outside the cabin. "At 280 feet, the wind comes steady from the southwest, almost never stops, almost never changes direction. At 100 feet, the wind is turbulent. It swirls. It carries moisture from the creek. It drops and starts and drops again. She drew 2 lines showing the airflow patterns. And the stone. At this elevation, the sandstone holds heat through the night. I measured it once with a thermometer borrowed from the doctor in town. 68 degrees at midnight when the valley floor was 41. That steady warmth means the meat never sweats, never attracts mold, and never sours. But Brennan's stone gets cold at night? Cold enough that moisture condenses on the meat, and then the morning sun heats it suddenly. That cycle of cold and hot is exactly what causes spoilage. Willa wrote everything down in her notebook. 3 factors, she said. Elevation, consistent wind, stone temperature. Remove any one of them, and the system fails. Linnea nodded. Grandmother Margaret understood this. The people in her village thought the drying ridge was magic. It was not magic. It was paying attention to what the land offered. The investment cost Brennan $200 in materials and spoiled beef. The embarrassment cost him more. He blamed Samuel, accused the boy of lying, of deliberately giving him wrong information, of sabotaging his operation. Samuel protested that he had reported everything exactly as he saw it, but Brennan did not want explanations. He wanted someone to punish. You are finished, Brennan told Samuel. Get out of my sight, and if I ever see you on my land again, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Samuel had nowhere to go. He walked back toward the Mesa trail in the dark, his few possessions in a canvas bag over his shoulder, his stomach empty, his future uncertain. He could have kept walking, could have left Copper Valley and found somewhere new, somewhere that did not know his shame. Instead, he climbed the trail. Tobias found him sitting at the top in the moonlight, his back against a rock, Flint watching him with her amber eyes. What are you doing here? Samuel looked up. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. And I need to tell you something, he said, and then you can decide what to do with me. Tobias sat down across from him, his arms crossed, his expression hard. I am listening. Mr. Brennan paid me to watch you. $2 a week. I told him everything. The angle of the racks, the spacing, the timing, everything. Tobias's hands curled into fists. I could kill you, he said quietly. Right now. Push you off this cliff and no one would ever know. Samuel did not step back, did not flinch. You could, but I am not here to lie anymore. I am here to tell the truth. Why? Why now? Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he said, because I watched your sister these past weeks. I saw her work from sunrise to midnight. I saw her hands bleed from the rope burns. I saw her give half her food to that dog and eat only what was left. He paused. Oh, and 3 weeks ago, after that storm ruined 40 pounds of drying meat, I saw her crying, alone, behind the cabin. I was supposed to report that to Brennan. Tell him she was breaking. Tell him to push harder. His voice dropped. But she was not breaking. She was crying because she was tired. And then she got up and started figuring out how to fix it. And I realized I was on the wrong side. Tobias stared at him. Brennan will not forgive this. I know. You will have nowhere to go if we send you away. I know that too. Linnea's voice came from behind them, soft in the darkness. Then you had better stay. She had heard everything. You could have kept lying, she said to Samuel. You could have kept taking his money until there was nothing left to learn. You chose to tell the truth instead. She paused. Quan, that is the only thing that matters now. Samuel looked at her with something like wonder. You are not angry? I am furious. Her voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. But anger does not build anything. And right now, I need builders. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. Tomorrow you will tell me everything Brennan is planning, and then we will make sure it does not work. The drought began in the spring of 1884. Nobody noticed at first. Spring in Copper Valley was always dry. The snow melt from the mountains filled Willow Creek through April and May, and by June, the summer thunderstorms usually arrived to keep the wells topped off. But that year, the snow melt came early and ended fast. By mid-May, the creek was running lower than anyone could remember. By June, it had dropped to half its normal level. And the thunderstorms did not come. Day after day, the sky stayed clear. Bright blue from horizon to horizon, not a cloud in sight. The sun beat down on the valley without mercy. The grass turned yellow, then brown. The cattle that had fattened on spring grass began to thin. Old Martha Briggs, who had climbed the Mesa Trail the year before to validate Linnea's work, stopped by the general store one June afternoon and shook her head at the sky. "I remember '56, she said to anyone who would listen. "Creek went dry in April. By August, there was nothing left. Cattle died in the fields. People died in their houses. Those who could left. Those who could not." She trailed off. "It will rain," Garrett Holloway said confidently. "Always does." It did not rain. July came, and the creek dropped to a trickle, and wells that had never failed began to struggle. Pumps that once drew water in minutes now took an hour to fill a bucket. August came, and Willow Creek went dry. For the first time in 40 years of continuous settlement, there was no water flowing through Copper Valley. Marcus Brennan's well held longer than most. It was deeper, better positioned, fed by an underground spring that had never failed. As other wells went dry, desperate ranchers came to Brennan with cash in hand. Brennan raised his price to 10 cents a gallon, then 15, then 20. By September, Marcus Brennan was the most hated man in Kittredge County, and also the most necessary. The drought devastated the valley. Garrett Holloway lost 50 head of cattle in 2 weeks. They died in the fields, too weak to walk to water that no longer existed. Holloway's wife, Ellen, one helped drag the carcasses to pits that had to be dug in ground so hard it took 3 men to break through. Tom Ridley slaughtered 80 head in a single week because he could not feed or water them. The meat was worth almost nothing. Everyone had meat. Nobody had a way to preserve it. In the valley, without water for brining and without green wood for smoking, there was no way to keep beef from spoiling. Meat rotted on the ground while families went hungry 20 miles away. Father Callahan held services every Sunday for a congregation that grew smaller each week as families packed their wagons and headed east. He buried 3 children that summer, dead from illnesses that would not have been fatal if their families had not been so weak from hunger and thirst. Pete Yardley, who had bet $5 against the Whitfields 2 years before, lost his family's claim when the well went dry. Everything he had laughed about, everything he had dismissed, came back to mock him as he watched his father's life work turn to dust. Jonas Mercer watched the valley he had known for 40 years wither. He wrote in his journal, "I have never seen the land so broken. I fear we will all be broken with it." And on Devil's Table Mesa, the Whitfield siblings worked around the clock. The drought that destroyed the valley was, on top of the mesa, simply a guarantee of faster drying. The wind blew harder and drier than ever. The sun beat down on the rock without a single cloud for weeks. The air was so parched that Linnea's lips cracked within minutes of stepping outside. And the meat dried so quickly she had to check the racks every 4 hours to prevent overdrying. She bought beef at 3 cents a pound from ranchers who were desperate to sell. 4 cents. 2 cents. By August, some ranchers were giving meat away just to avoid watching it rot. Linnea took everything they offered. She ran her racks day and night, turning strips in the darkness by lantern light with Flint at her heels. Tobias built 4 new racks to handle the volume. Willa kept records of every batch, tracking drying times that had dropped from 36 hours to 24. Samuel proved his worth 10 times over. He hauled loads up the mesa without rest. He stood guard at night when Linnea worried about thieves. He delivered finished jerky to freighters in Silver Ridge, negotiating prices that kept the operation solvent. Word spread. Freighters came from 3 counties. The Army doubled its order, then tripled it. Merchants from Silver Ridge rode out with cash in hand, desperate for preserved food that would last the winter. The dried beef that had seemed like a curiosity was suddenly the most valuable commodity in the valley, and the Whitfields were the only ones who could produce it. Pete Yardley showed up at the base of the Mesa Trail one August afternoon, hat in hand, his young man's arrogance burned away by weeks of watching his family's cattle die. "I need work," he said to Tobias, who happened to be coming down with a load of dried beef. "I will do anything." Tobias remembered the bet, remembered the laughter in the saloon, remembered the confident prediction that the Whitfields would beg for creek bottom land by September. "Ma, my sister makes those decisions," he said. "Not me." Pete climbed the trail. He found Linnea sorting meat by the racks, her movements quick and efficient despite the exhaustion that showed in the shadows under her eyes. He stood there for a long moment. unable to meet her gaze. "I was wrong," he said finally, "about everything." Linnea looked at him, at the shame on his face, at the desperation in his eyes. She handed him a knife. "Can you slice beef at a quarter inch?" "I can learn." "Then start learning." Pete Yardley worked on the Mesa for 3 weeks until the drought broke and he could help rebuild his family's claim. He never made another bet against anyone, and he never forgot who gave him a chance when he deserved none. Clara Brennan arrived at the base of the Mesa Trail on a September morning, alone, her face set with determination. She was 38 years old, the wife of Marcus Brennan for 16 years, the mother of 3 children who had watched their father become the most hated man in Kittredge County. She climbed the trail without stopping and found Linnea sorting dried apricots in the morning sun. "I know you have no reason to help me," Clara said before Linnea could speak. "My husband has done everything he can to destroy you. He raised the water price. He sent a spy. He would burn this place to the ground if he thought he could get away with it." Linnea said nothing. "But I have 3 children, and I need to know how to feed them when this drought ends and everything is different. I need to know how to survive without depending on him." She paused. "Please, teach me." Tobias had followed Clara up the trail. He stood now with his arms crossed, his face hard. "She is the wife of our enemy," he said. "Everything you teach her goes back to Brennan." "It will not," Clara said. "How can we trust that?" "Because I am leaving him." Silence fell over the mesa. "Not today," Clara continued. "Not until the drought ends and I have somewhere to go. But I am leaving. I have seen what he has become, what he always was if I am honest. I cannot raise my children in that house any longer." Clara's eldest daughter, Emma, sometimes came with her mother in the weeks that followed. She was a curious girl of 7 who watched everything and asked questions that showed she was already learning. Linnea remembered a passage from Margaret's journal, one she had read 100 times but never fully understood until now. "A recipe shared is a recipe improved. A skill taught returns to the teacher twice over. Wisdom hoarded is wisdom lost." "Tomorrow," Linnea said. 6 in the morning. Bring a sharp knife." The wife of Linnea's worst enemy came to ask for help. Tobias said no. Linnea said yes. "What would you have decided, and why?" Share your thoughts in the comments before we continue. 2 nights after Clara Brennan's first lesson on the Mesa, someone set fire to the drying racks. Linnea woke to Flint's frantic barking and the smell of smoke. She threw open the cabin door and saw flames licking at the 2 nearest frames. Orange against the black sky, wood crackling as the fire consumed wood that had taken days to shape. Tobias was already running, bucket in hand, water sloshing. Samuel came behind him with a shovel, beating at the flames. Willa hauled water from the cistern in a pot, in a pan, in anything she could find. They saved the rest. But 2 racks were gone. 40 pounds of drying beef was ash. A month of work had vanished in minutes. Flint stood at the edge of the burned area, her hackles raised, growling at the darkness below. Whoever had done this was already gone, vanished down the trail before anyone could see them, and everyone knew who was responsible. "No proof," Tobias said bitterly, standing over the smoldering remains as the first gray light of dawn touched the mesa. "He sent someone in the night. No one saw anything. No one can prove anything." "We do not need proof," Linnea said. "Then what do we do?" She looked at the ruins, the blackened wood, the wasted meat, the careful work destroyed by a man who could not bear to see them succeed. "We rebuild," she said, "stronger than before. That is the only answer worth giving." This time they drove iron stakes into the stone and lashed the rack posts to them with wire that would not burn. They built the frames from thicker lumber. They positioned them farther from each other, spread across the mesa, so that no single fire could destroy everything. It took 2 weeks, and when they finished, they had 32 racks instead of 24. Clara learned quickly. She came every morning at 6 and stayed until noon, walking back down the trail in time to prepare dinner for children who did not know their mother was planning a different future. She learned to slice meat at exactly a quarter-inch thickness. She learned to read the wind, to know when a rack needed turning, to recognize the difference between properly dried beef and beef that would spoil within a week. Linnea held nothing back. "The angle matters," she explained, adjusting Clara's knife technique. Cut with the grain for strips that hold together. Cut against the grain for strips that tear apart. The spacing matters. She showed Clara how half an inch between slats allowed airflow while preventing waste. Any wider and small pieces fall through. Any narrower and moisture gets trapped. The timing matters. She taught Clara to press dried meat between thumb and forefinger, testing firmness. Too soft and it will mold. Too brittle and it has lost its flavor. You want leather, not wood. Clara absorbed everything. She had practical hands and sharp eyes, and she asked questions that showed she understood not just the steps, but the reasons behind them. Other women followed. Ellen Holloway came next, her pride swallowed by necessity. Her husband had lost half his cattle to the drought, and she needed to learn how to preserve what remained. Then came Rebecca Yardley, Pete's mother, who had watched her family's claim wither and wanted to salvage something from the disaster. Then a rancher's daughter from the next county who had heard about the drying operation from a freighter and ridden 40 miles to see it. Linnea turned no one away. She taught openly, held nothing back, and found that the more she taught, the more clearly she understood her own methods. Teaching sharpened what practice had roughened. Tobias eventually stopped objecting. "You are giving away our advantage," he said one evening, watching Linnea demonstrate the proper salt mixture to 3 women at once. "I am spreading it," Linnea corrected. "If one person knows how to preserve food, one family survives. If 50 people know, a community survives. And the knowledge lives on even if we do not." The drought broke in late October of 1884. The rains came suddenly, 3 days of steady downpour that filled every cistern, every well, every dry creek bed in the valley. Willow Creek rose 2 feet overnight. Cattle that had been dying of thirst stood in the rain and drank until they could barely walk. But the damage was done. Half the claims in Kittredge County had been abandoned. 40 families had packed their wagons and left for places with more water and less memory. The herds that once grazed the valley meadows were reduced by half and would take years to rebuild. Marcus Brennan had made a fortune from the drought. His well had never failed. His water prices had made him rich while his neighbors suffered. But his fortune came with a cost. Nobody trusted him. Nobody would work for him. Nobody invited him to gatherings or stopped to talk when he passed on the road. He had become wealthy, and in the process, he had become utterly alone. Clara filed for divorce in November. It was scandalous. Women in Kittredge County did not divorce their husbands, no matter how cruel or greedy those husbands might be. Father Callahan warned Clara that she would be casting herself out of respectable society. Her own mother wrote to beg her to reconsider. Clara moved into a small cabin near the base of Devil's Table Mesa with her 3 children and continued her work with Linnea. She never went back. 2 years after the drought, in the autumn of 1886, Jonas Mercer climbed the Mesa Trail for the second time. He was 69 years old now, and the climb was harder than before. His knees ached, his breath came short. But Jonas Mercer had something to say, and he was not the kind of man to send a message when he could deliver it himself. Flint, gray-muzzled and slower than she once was, met him at the top and escorted him to the cabin with the quiet dignity of an old soldier. The mesa had changed. 60 drying racks now covered the flat stone, arranged in careful rows, angled into the prevailing wind. 4 storehouses had been cut into the east face of the rock, blasted from the sandstone with black powder and lined with dry-laid stone. A hand-painted sign at the base of the trail read, "Whitfield Drying Works, EUAST, 1882. Jonas stood at the edge of the mesa and looked out over the valley, the green ribbon of Willow Creek running strong again, or the scattered rooftops of claims that had survived the drought. The wagon road curving south toward Silver Ridge. Then he turned and looked at the rows of drying racks, the storehouses cut into the rock, the bundles of dried fruit stacked under the cabin eaves. Linnea was sitting on an upturned crate with a knife in her hand, slicing apricots. She looked up when he approached. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitfield." He stood there for a long moment, his hat in his hands, the wind pulling at his coat. "I told people this land was good for nothing," he said finally. "I remember. I was wrong." Linnea set down her knife. "You were not wrong about the land, Jonas. You were wrong about what the land was for." He nodded slowly, taking in her words, the truth of them. I suppose that is a lesson I should have learned 40 years ago. Most people never learn it at all. She gestured to the crate beside her. Sit down, have some jerky, and tell me what brings the wisest cattleman in the valley to a bare rock mesa. Jonas sat. He chewed a strip of dried beef that tasted exactly like beef and salt and wind and nothing else. I am not the wisest anything, he said. I proved that when I laughed at 3 orphans who knew more than I did. He paused. I have a grandson, 16 years old, smart boy but stubborn, does not want to ranch cattle, says the future is in something else, though he does not know what. And I want him to learn from someone who sees what other people miss, someone who can teach him to think instead of just follow. Linnea considered this. Send him up the trail. We will see if he can learn. Marcus Brennan's end came quietly. The drought of 1887 was smaller than the one 3 years earlier, but it was enough to break him. His well, the famous well that had made him wealthy while his neighbors suffered, finally failed in August of that year. The underground spring that had fed it for 50 years simply stopped flowing. Nobody came to his aid. The families he had gouged during the first drought remembered every penny they had paid for water that should have been shared. The community he had exploited closed ranks against him. When he rode into Silver Ridge looking for credit, every merchant turned him away. Clara had taken the children and rebuilt her life on the Mesa, learning Linnea's methods, building her own small operation. She wanted nothing from her former husband. She asked nothing. She simply continued working, continued learning, continued surviving. Marcus Brennan left Copper Valley on a November night, his wagon loaded with what remained of his possessions. No one saw him go. No one asked where he was going. No one ever saw him again. In the spring of 1895, a professor from the Colorado Agricultural College rode up the Mesa Trail with 2 assistants and a wagon full of measuring equipment. Professor Harold Whitman had read about the Whitfield operation in a farming journal and traveled 200 miles to see it for himself. He spent 3 days on the Mesa, measuring wind speed with an anemometer, recording rock temperatures at different times of day, analyzing the moisture content of dried beef at various stages of the process. Remarkable, he said to Linnea on his final afternoon, his notebook filled with numbers and calculations. Absolutely remarkable. What did you find? Your method is approximately 2.3 times more efficient than traditional smokehouse preservation. The constant wind velocity, the thermal mass of the sandstone, the elevation-reducing pest activity, these factors combine to create near-optimal desiccation conditions. He paused, looking at her with something like awe. Your grandmother discovered this through careful observation. Modern science is only now beginning to understand the principles involved. Linnea touched the worn journal in her apron pocket. She was a careful woman. She wrote down everything she learned. That journal, Professor Whitman said, should be in a museum. It is a scientific document of considerable importance. Perhaps someday. For now, it stays with me. The professor published his findings in a journal that was read across 4 states. The article brought visitors from as far as Wyoming and Montana, all wanting to learn the Whitfield method. Linnea taught them all. Marcus Brennan tried everything to destroy the Whitfields. He raised water prices. He sent a spy. He set fire to their racks. In the end, what destroyed him was not revenge or justice, but simply the turning of the world. The community he had exploited refused to help him when his own fortune failed. What do you think this story is telling us about power and community? Share your thoughts before we continue to the final chapter. 15 years passed. The trail up Devil's Table Mesa had been widened and graded, with proper stone steps climbing the last 50 feet. The drying racks now numbered over 100, built and rebuilt and improved over the years. The storehouses carved into the rock had multiplied from 4 to 8, filled with dried beef, dried apples, dried apricots packed tight in wooden boxes, sealed with pine pitch. The hand-painted sign at the base of the trail now read, Whitfield Drying Works, EST, 1882, known across 4 states. Linnea was 37 years old. Her hands were brown and hard as saddle leather, the hands of someone who had spent 15 years working outdoors in wind and sun. Her hair was threaded with gray, and she moved a little slower on the steep parts of the trail than she used to. But her eyes were the same, gray and calm and watchful, taking in everything, giving nothing away until she chose to. Tobias had married. His wife was Sarah Holloway, was the eldest daughter of Garrett Holloway, the man who had once laughed loudest at the orphans claiming the Devil's Rock. The wedding had been the talk of the county, vindication made visible, the son of tragedy joining with the daughter of mockery. Tobias now managed the logistics of the drying operation, coordinating shipments to 4 states, negotiating contracts with the Army and with freight companies from Denver to Santa Fe. He had grown into a serious man, steady and reliable. The hothead temper of his youth cooled into something more patient. Willa had become a teacher. She ran a small school in the valley, teaching children to read and write and calculate. But she also taught them science, real science, the kind that explained why the Mesa dried meat faster than the valley, why the wind mattered, why the angle of the racks had to be exactly 15 degrees. She had taken her grandmother's journal and turned it into a curriculum. Samuel Dawes, no longer a hungry boy of 17, managed a second drying station on a mesa 12 miles east. He had used Linnea's plans and Linnea's methods to build something of his own, and he employed 6 people year-round. He had never forgotten who gave him a chance when no one else would. Clara Brennan ran her own operation now, smaller than Linnea's but profitable and growing. Her daughter Emma, now 19, worked beside her, having learned the trade from childhood. Her 2 sons had claims of their own, built on skills their mother had learned on Devil's Table Mesa. The women Linnea had taught during the drought had scattered across the county, spreading the knowledge further. Some had started their own operations. Others had taught their daughters and sons. The method that had once seemed like foolishness was now common wisdom, practiced by dozens of families across 4 states. Flint died on a cold December morning in the winter of 1897. Linnea found her at the top of the trail, in the spot where she had sat every day for 15 years, watching the path for visitors, guarding the mesa against threats that rarely came anymore. The old dog was curled in her usual position, her muzzle resting on her paws, her gray fur ruffled by the morning wind. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply decided to sleep longer than usual and had never woken up. Linnea sat down beside her. The wind blew cold from the southwest, the same wind that had blown every day since Linnea first climbed this trail as a 22-year-old orphan with a journal and a prayer. She remembered the morning Flint had appeared, thin and starving, sitting at the bottom of the path as if she had been waiting for them to arrive. She remembered Willa's voice asking if they could keep her, the first note of hope since their parents died. She remembered Flint lying beside her on the nights when the work was too hard, and the doubt was too heavy, and the future was nothing but dark. She remembered Flint pressing against her side when the fire destroyed the racks, a warm presence in the cold shock of loss. 15 years, through everything. Linnea buried Flint under a cairn of flat stones at the edge of the mesa, in a spot with a view of the whole valley. She worked alone, and carrying the stones one by one, stacking them with care until the pile was solid enough to last 100 years. When she finished, she sat beside the cairn until dark. She did not cry. She had done her crying long ago, in a frozen graveyard in Pennsylvania, digging graves for parents who deserved more time than they got. But she sat, and she remembered, and she said goodbye to the truest friend she had ever known. Flint stayed with Linnea for 15 years, through every hardship, every victory, every quiet moment of doubt. Now Spark, Flint's daughter, has taken her place at the top of the trail. Take a moment to remember someone, human or animal, who stood beside you through difficult times. Share their story in the comments if you feel comfortable. We would be honored to hear it. Spark had been watching from a distance. She was Flint's daughter, born 3 years earlier, a gray dog with the same amber eyes and the same habit of sitting perfectly still in the wind. She had learned her mother's routines, picked up her mother's watchfulness, inherited her mother's quiet loyalty. When Linnea finally stood up from the cairn, stiff and cold in the fading light, Spark walked over and pressed against her leg. Linnea looked down at those amber eyes, so like Flint's that visitors sometimes did not notice the difference. "All right," she said softly. "Your turn now." Spark walked to the top of the trail and sat down in exactly the spot where Flint had always sat. And she waited. The autumn of 1897 was golden. The valley below was painted in shades of amber and red, cottonwoods blazing along Willow Creek, and the last warmth of the year settling over the land like a benediction. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. Cattle grazed in meadows that had recovered from the droughts of years past. Children played in yards that had been bare dirt when Linnea first arrived. It was a Saturday afternoon in October when Linnea walked to the edge of the mesa and stood looking out over everything she had built. Not alone anymore. Not three orphans against the world. Behind her, the drying racks held the last of the autumn apricots, each one sliced and laid out to catch the wind that never stopped. The storehouses were full. The account books showed profits that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young woman who had dug her parents' graves in frozen ground. Below, someone was climbing the trail. Linnea watched the figure approach. It was Emma, Clara's daughter, now a young woman of 19, climbing the mesa path with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. She carried a canvas sack over one shoulder and a bundle of letters in her hand. Emma had never known a time when Devil's Table was empty. She had never known a time when the Whitfield name was a joke. To her, the Mesa had always been a place of work and purpose, and Linnea had always been the woman who had built it. That was exactly as it should be. The girl reached the top, patted Spark absently on the head, and walked over to Linnea. "Mail from Silver Ridge," she said, handing over the letters, "and plums from the Ridley orchard. Mrs. Ridley said to tell you they are the best of the season." "Thank you, Emma." The girl lingered, looking out at the valley with the untroubled gaze of someone too young to remember the drought, too young to remember the mockery, too young to understand what it had cost to build this place. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "my mother told me that people laughed at you when you claimed this land. Is that really true?" Linnea smiled. "It was true." "Why would they laugh?" "Because they could not see what I saw. They looked at this rock and saw everything it lacked. No water, no shade, no shelter from the wind. They saw what was missing." "What did you see?" Linnea turned and looked at the racks full of drying fruit, the storehouses carved into the stone, the operation that had saved lives during the drought and built a future from a bare slab of rock. "I saw exactly the same things they saw," she said. "When I just understood that a limitation and an advantage are often the same thing, it depends on what you are trying to do." Emma considered this, her young face thoughtful. "That is what my mother says. She says you taught her that. I taught her to dry meat. She taught herself the rest." The girl smiled and ran back down the trail, letters and plums delivered, her footsteps light on the stone. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the mountains and the mesa glowed orange in the fading light, Linnea sat alone outside the cabin with Margaret's journal open in her lap. The pages were soft as cloth now, handled so many times over so many years that they barely held together. But the words were still clear, written in careful German script by a woman who had died 30 years before Linnea built her first drying rack. She turned to the passage she had read on the night her parents died, in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania that no longer existed. "The neighbors said we were fools. The wind tore our clothes and our patience. But the meat dried clean and the fruit dried sweet, and by winter we had more preserved food than anyone in the valley. The wind does the work. You only have to stand in it long enough." Linnea closed the journal. She had stood in the wind for 15 years. She had buried her parents, crossed a continent, claimed a cursed rock, and built something that would outlast her. She had proven that knowledge does not expire. It only waits for someone patient enough to use it. Tobias found her there an hour later, still sitting, the journal closed on her lap. "Sarah sent me to make sure you ate dinner," he said, sitting down beside her. I will eat." "You always say that." "I always do eat, eventually." He smiled. The smile looked natural on him now, after all these years. He had been so angry as a young man, so certain that Linnea's plan was madness. Now he was 33 years old, married, successful, the manager of an operation that fed families across 4 states. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had listened to them?" he asked. "To who?" "Brennan, Holloway, Mercer, all of them. What if we had believed them? Claimed some bottomland near the creek like sensible people?" Linnea was quiet for a moment. We would have survived, she said finally. Probably. We would have scraped by, done what everyone else did, never discovered what the Mesa could do. And during the drought, we would have suffered like everyone else, not maybe died like some of them did. Tobias nodded slowly. Sometimes I think about how close it was. If you had listened to me that first week, when I wanted to give up, if the accident with Slab had ended differently, if the fire had spread before we woke up. I think about it too. And? Linnea looked out at the valley, the darkening sky, the first stars appearing over the mountains. I think we were not lucky. I think we were prepared. I think Grandmother Margaret was right, and I was right to believe her, and every person who laughed at us was wrong for exactly the same reason. What reason? They saw what the land lacked. I saw what it offered. The same wind that drove other people away was exactly what I needed. She paused. Most people look at difficulty and see only obstacle. A few look at the same difficulty and see opportunity. The difference is not intelligence. It is not luck. It is simply paying attention to what is actually there, instead of what you expect to find. Tobias reached out and put his hand over hers, the way he had not done since they were children grieving beside their parents' graves. I am glad I stopped arguing, he said. I am glad you stayed. Willa came up the trail just before dark, a lantern in her hand, her notebook under her arm. At 30, she was no longer the silent, watchful girl who had clutched that notebook against her chest in the land office. She was a teacher, a scholar, a woman who had taken Margaretta's wisdom and shared it with a generation of children who would carry it into the future. The school board approved the expansion, she said, and we're sitting down on Linnea's other side. 10 more students next term. They want me to teach preservation science as a formal subject. Grandmother would be proud. I hope so. Willa opened her notebook to a page filled with neat columns of numbers. I have been tracking the drying times for 15 years now. The data supports everything she wrote. Average drying time, 32 hours in summer, 44 in winter. Less than half what a smokehouse takes, with better results and no fuel cost. She closed the notebook. Professor Whitman says other people are already experimenting with high-altitude drying in Wyoming, in Montana, in places where they read his article and realized the same things we realize. Good. You are not worried about competition? Linnea laughed softly. Yes, I spent 15 years teaching everyone who climbed this trail. Clara, Ellen, Rebecca, Samuel, every woman who came to learn during the drought. Why would I worry about people I will never meet learning the same lessons? Some people would. Some people think knowledge is like gold. Hoard it, guard it, keep it locked away so no one else can use it. She shook her head. Grandmother Margaret understood better. A recipe shared is a recipe improved. Knowledge spread is knowledge that survives. Keep it to yourself, and it dies with you. Willa was quiet for a moment. I miss her. Grandmother Margaret, I mean, even though I never met her. I miss her too, but she is here. Linnea touched the journal. She is in everything we built. She will be here long after we are gone. The night settled over Devil's Table Mesa, cool and clear, in the wind steady from the southwest as it had been every night for 15 years. Linnea sat with her brother and sister, looking out at the valley they had helped save and the sky full of stars. She thought about the land office in 1882, the laughter of men who had never been wrong before. She thought about Marcus Brennan, who had tried to destroy them and destroyed himself instead. She thought about Jonas Mercer, who had admitted his mistake and sent his grandson to learn. She thought about Clara, who had chosen courage when surrender would have been easier. She thought about Samuel, who had betrayed them and then redeemed himself. She thought about Flint, buried under stones where the wind would sing over her forever. And she thought about 3 orphan children standing at the back of a line, alone in the world, and with nothing but $47, a stubborn mule, and a grandmother's journal. They had done it, not by luck, not by accident, but by watching, listening, understanding what no one else understood, by standing in the wind long enough. The next morning, Linnea rose with the sun and walked out to check the drying racks. The apricots were perfect. Deep amber, firm but not brittle, sweet as the day they were picked. She would pack them in muslin today, seal them with pine pitch, ship them east on the next freight wagon. Spark walked beside her, quiet and watchful. The wind blew from the southwest, steady and dry. Another day, another batch. Another small piece of a legacy that had started with 3 orphans and a cursed rock. Somewhere below, she could hear the sound of footsteps on the trail. Someone was climbing up. Wait, maybe Emma with more mail. Maybe one of the women from the valley coming for a lesson. Maybe someone new, someone who had heard about the Whitfield operation and wanted to learn. There was always someone new. There was always more to teach. Linnea pulled her collar up against the wind and walked back toward the cabin. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the Mesa gold, and the work continued. In 1923, 41 years after Linnea Whitfield filed her claim on Devil's Table Mesa, a professor from the Colorado School of Mines led an expedition to document the original drying operation. What they found astonished them. The stone storehouses carved into the rock were still intact, still usable, still maintaining a steady temperature of 55 degrees year-round. The channels Linnea had cut to direct the wind toward the racks showed evidence of sophisticated aerodynamic thinking that would not be formally studied for another 30 years. The Journal of Margaret Whitfield, donated to the Colorado Historical Society by Willa Whitfield in 1918, was recognized as one of the earliest detailed accounts of open-air desiccation techniques in the Americas. The stone cairn marking Flint's grave still stood at the edge of the mesa, weathered but solid, visible from miles away. And the sign at the base of the trail, repainted many times over the decades, still read, Whitfield Drying Works, EST 1882. The professor wrote in his report, what Miss Whitfield accomplished on this mesa defied every prediction made by experienced settlers and ranchers of her time. She demonstrated that scientific observation and traditional knowledge, properly applied, can transform apparent limitations into decisive advantages. Her operation saved lives during the Great Drought of 1884. It trained hundreds of people in preservation techniques that are still in use today. And it proved that the most worthless land in a valley can become the most valuable when someone has the vision to see its true purpose. He concluded, the lesson of Devil's Table Mesa is not that Linnea Whitfield was lucky. It is that she was prepared. She studied. She observed. She trusted knowledge that others dismissed as obsolete. And she had the courage to stake everything on what she learned. That is not luck. That is wisdom. And wisdom, unlike luck, can be taught. Here's the end final message. Thank you for staying with the story of the Whitfield siblings to the very end. 3 orphans who claimed cursed land when everyone laughed, who trusted an old woman's journal when everyone said it was foolish, who built something that lasted. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling us what you will remember most about Linnea, Tobias, and Willa, and remember the lesson of Devil's Table Mesa. Knowledge does not expire. It only waits for someone patient enough to use it. A limitation and an advantage are often the same thing. It depends on what you are trying to do. There is always more to learn. There is always more to teach. Until next time.